From the moment I saw Chiori, just based on aesthetics and personality alone, I knew I had to get her. However, now that she's here, I have mixed feelings. As someone who loves all the characters her gameplay has similarities with, it was pretty obvious that I'd love actually playing as her. But while there are a lot of positives, there are some negatives too, and she's not quite what I had hoped for. There are also some key details where my experience is very different to the general consensus on her that I've seen so far. Let's review her story, kit build, and playstyle and see if I can find a place for her in my teams. Chiori first showed up in the Roses and Muskets event in version 4.3 and I was immediately smitten. Her design is simply stunning. The earthy color scheme, the intricate and cohesive details, the classic yet modern feel, she instantly shot up to the top tier for me. I particularly appreciated that for once we have a character with dark brown hair, which feels weirdly rare in Genshin. I also loved her attitude. She's confident and assertive and generally has the air that she's done dealing with stupid people and could not care less what anyone else thinks. She's ambitious, creative and passionate, strong-headed and a bit of a perfectionist, and clearly has a problem with authority. Her voice acting and even her facial expressions did a great job of emphasizing her character, while also giving her a slightly softer side which makes her personality feel rounded. Her backstory also appealed to me quite a lot. As a child of middle-class merchants from Inazuma, her parents and teachers failed to direct her restless energy until she discovered a deep love for fabrics and tailoring. She still sent countless teachers storming off in frustration, but despite that, she learned. She pursued her dream of becoming a fashion designer and seamstress and emigrated to Fontaine, where she runs a highly successful fashion boutique. She's even noted in-game as the creator of several of my other beloved characters' outfits. I studied art and design in college, and one of my favorite experiences there was designing and creating a custom dress. When it was time to move on to a more specialized course, I came very close to studying fashion design, and I still feel I'd have loved it. While her personality is wildly different to mine, in many ways we're polar opposites, I can't help but appreciate her. I've also played through her story quest already. I'll avoid spoilers, but overall it was brilliant. The setup is that Fontaine's Fashion Week is fast approaching and Chiori's preparations are thrown into disarray by a jealous rival who tries to destroy her boutique's reputation and drive her out of business. Cue drama, intrigue, a battle in the press, and a tense build-up to a satisfying conclusion with a gorgeous cinematic. The quality of the character story quest has been fantastic throughout Fontaine, and Chiori's was top tier and really brought her to life even more. Though seriously, I am once again very upset that the Traveler does not get a new outfit. I definitely wanted her regardless of how strong she'd be in combat, and I had a ton of primos saved up. But there was also a lot of other stuff that I wanted. Since my Cinnabar spindle belongs to Albedo, I would need a weapon for Chiori, and my weapon banner luck has been so awful that surely it's time for it to turn. I was also very tempted by the new Chronicled Wish banner, since there are several weapons on there that I'd really want, including most of the standard ones, Lost Prayer the most of all. And if all things went well, I even thought I could buy the big top up for the first time this year and finally get myself an Ito. Unfortunately, somebody at Hoyo has clearly cursed my account. I lost my 50-50 at 78 pity, and it took another 78 wishes before Chiori deigned to come home. Against my better judgment, I did wish on the weapon banner too, and had the worst luck possible. A second copy of one of the least useful standard weapons, a stone thresher I don't really need, and a total of 199 wishes later, I had Chiori's stupid stick. This always happens. Will I ever learn? So, she was an absolute smash hit for me in terms of design and story, but my wishing was an absolute nightmare. With that out of the way, what about her kit? She's a Geo user who wields dual swords with fast and dynamic normal attacks. Unless you have her C6, however, her normals are pretty much irrelevant. Her burst is a big flash of Geo damage with a generous AoE and a comparatively low cost. It has an absolutely gorgeous animation, so even though its damage is nothing groundbreaking, I still work it into my Chiori rotations. Her skill is the core of her kit. At first, it's similar to Kaching or Alhaitham's. With a tap, it teleports her towards the nearest enemy, while if you hold the button, you can aim before teleporting. After Chiori reappears, the tomato doll is summoned to the field, which will trigger geo damage every 3.6 seconds for a total of 5 hits. If a geo construct exists on the field, or if one is created while the tomato is present, a second doll will appear, doubling the number of slashes. Note that these dolls do not count as constructs and cannot be destroyed by enemies, so this damage is extremely consistent. It's also worth noting that their attack timing and ICD are designed to ensure that the second doll does not increase Chiori's geo application, so you do not get extra crystallized reactions with the second one on field. Finally, for a brief period after Chiori teleports, a trefoil appears on the screen. If you tap the skill again while this is visible, you will instantly switch to the next character in your team, even in mid-air. Alongside the next 2 normal, charged, or plunging attacks by any party member within the next 8 seconds, Tomato will also perform a powerful coordinated attack. Both this coordinated attack and Tomato's passive attack count as skill damage. If you don't tap the skill that second time, then Chiori gains a geo infusion for a brief period. Sadly, her damage is so low that this is a bit pointless, unless you pull for her C6, which gives her much stronger scaling on her normal attacks. This means that Chiori is exclusively a sub-DPS character and doesn't really add anything else to the team. She's quite good at what she does, but I have to admit, I was hoping for a little more. Specifically, I was hoping she would also be a support character who provides some kind of buff to the team. This would have actually made her even more similar to Albedo with his EM buff, but there are many other ways she could have helped out her teams. Before we get to the teams and how my experience has been a little different, let's quickly run through her build. Both her skill and burst have dual scaling. They benefit from both attack and defense. However, due to the relative strength of the multipliers, she strongly prefers defense. As a result, there are only a handful of swords which are worth considering for her. The most accessible option would be the Harbinger of Dawn, which is great for her since she stays off field and is unlikely to use much HP unless you run her with Furina. Cinnabar Spindle is fantastic too, and the Wolf Fang from the Battle Pass is a viable option. Amenoma Kakuchi would also be a good free-to-play alternative if you want Furina on her team. Her best in slot, of course, is her signature Uraku Misugiri, which is what my Chiori has. For artifacts, she wants quite a mix of stats. Her best build will be defense, geo damage, and crit main stats with a generous helping of crit, defense, and attack from substats, and a smidgen of ER to keep her burst up. Defense goblets and circlets are also viable, though her damage with those would be a little lower. Attack main stat artifacts may also be viable if you're really struggling or if they come with fantastic substats, but are best avoided. Her ideal artifact set is 4-piece Golden Troop with 4-piece Husk just a little behind in second place, and mixed 2-piece defense, attack, geo damage or skill damage sets as a viable option. By some evil miracle, in all my months of farming Golden Troop, I have yet to find a single acceptable defense sans, and thus, even though the rest of my attempted golden build for Chiori is pretty good, the attack sans is bringing her damage down a little bit. My Albedo, on the other hand, has a 4-piece Husk set which she could borrow, but it comes with a defense circlet instead. I put both sets into heavy testing and also compared a mixed set with the best of both as a 2-piece set, and overall the damage was incredibly consistent with only minor differences. The 4-piece sets came on top overall because of the powerful passives. Results will vary depending on what artifacts you happen to have available. For now, I've raised her skill to level 9 and her burst to level 8 and left her normals at level 1. I will also be keeping her at C0. I've spent many hours testing out different team combinations, and honestly, she's more flexible than I had expected. To maximize her damage, you generally want a character on the team who can create a geo construct, but I've been very happy without one as well. More detail on that later. That said, my favorite teams for her do tend to include one of those characters. She's very well suited for mono geo teams. Like Albedo, she's a great sub-DPS who benefits from the synergy between most geo characters, and she outshines him in these teams due to her higher scalings. Chiori and Albedo are actually very fun together as a dual off-field damage core, much like the combination of Yelan and Xingqiu. I was particularly surprised by these two with Furina and Kokumi, which felt fantastic and did surprisingly good damage. Most of the time, however, I found myself pairing her up with Zhongli. In addition to his impenetrable shield, his resistant shred is highly valuable, so he's probably her best partner. This combination works just about anywhere. The ones I like the most are probably teams with Yelan and Yoimiya, this interesting team with Shenhe and Wriothesley, or again, that Furina and Kokomi pairing. As for those teams with Chiori without any Geo constructs, I spent the least of my time trying those out. She works well enough, but she's definitely outshone by the other options. For example, Chiori with Furina, Bennett and Yanfei definitely felt quite comfortable, but was noticeably less impressive than various teams involving double Geo. Navia teams are a bit of an exception, however. One I really enjoyed is Navia Plunge with Furina and Shenyun. While it's less than ideal for both Chiori and Navia, the strength of Geo Resonance and Navia's powerful plunges make up for it. More on that in a minute as well. One team I'm excited to fully explore is Furina, Zhongli, Chiori and Noelle. I need to finish building my Noelle, but even in her current state, this team feels phenomenal. It's worth noting that one place where Albedo is still much better than Chiori is as a support and sub DPS in a Hyperbloom team. His elemental mastery buff means he's a great addition to those teams, while Chiori is a little out of her element in a team like that. Overall, I've been very pleasantly surprised by how useful she is in a wide variety of teams. She might not be the first pick in many of these, but she's a great option to have if you happen to need one of the more sought-after alternatives for the other side of the abyss. Her damage is incredibly consistent, and her playstyle has unique quirks which make her fun to play. The double skill tap to swap in mid-air is particularly satisfying. As to those places I mentioned where my experience has differed from the consensus, first off, many people complain that in their opinion, Hoyo have locked part of her kit into her first constellation, and they feel that she's useless with Navia without it. For me, it's just a fairly typical example of a quality of life constellation which opens up a handful of teams. If the discussions I've seen are typical, then the difference in damage is overstated. I've seen many people say that she loses half of her damage in Navia teams without this constellation. However, even if you exclusively use her skill, that would only be true if you ignore the skill's initial slash damage and her coordinated attacks. If you look at the multipliers, each upward slash is roughly twice as strong as a tomato attack. 3 upward slashes compared to 5 attacks per doll means that in reality, she only loses 1/3 of her skill's damage if you don't have that second doll. It's still a significant enough difference that it's worth keeping in mind, but she definitely does not miss out on half of her damage. Second, in my opinion, her burst is underrated. Its damage is roughly equivalent to 20% of her skill total damage output with 2 tomatoes, or 30% of the total with 1 tomato. Or, put another way, either 16% or 24% of her total damage output. Considering how important it can be in the abyss to do large amounts of damage in one short period of time, I think it's a bad idea to skip it. And with that in mind, looking back on the value of getting that second tomato doll, it actually only increases her damage output by a little over 25%. That's still a significant boost, but it's far from the 100% which I've seen some people claim. I find it fascinating that people complain about her C1, considering that its damage boost only occurs in a subset of her teams, yet they're perfectly fine with Raiden's C2, which is a DPS increase of over 40% compared to a C1 Raiden, or Neverlet C1, which removed one of the few limitations to his kit. Chiori's C1 still requires a second Geo character in the team, so even with it enabled, she still has most of her limitations intact. I'm actually quite happy with C0 Chiori in Navia teams. To really drive this home, I tried out 2 variations on the Navia Plunge team I mentioned earlier, comparing the team with Chiori against the team with Bennett. With C0 Chiori, her version of this team was only slightly slower at clearing the first chamber than Bennett's version. Her damage output came close to compensating for the loss of Bennett, even though I got lucky with the enemy staying with his circle for the entire time. The Chiori team is not tied to any circle, so it feels much less restrictive to play, and may be better against more mobile enemies. To be clear, this is a team where we'd expect Chiori not to be particularly useful, and she's almost as good as one of the best characters in the game. Of course, the choice of whether to bring a sub DPS or a buffer will largely depend on what you're going up against. There are situations where one is clearly superior to the other. Finally, I've seen people say she has split scaling, and this is simply false. Split scaling is when a character has talents which needs one stat and other talents which require a different stat. For example, Xinyan's shield scales of defense, while her other talents scale of attack. When building her, you have to choose between a build which maximizes her shield, one which maximizes her damage, or one which is mediocre at both. Chiori's skill and burst have dual scaling instead. They scale from both her attack and her defense at the same time. There is no dilemma when building her, since her relevant talents combine whatever stats you happen to have. I've only seen a few people say this, but it definitely bears emphasizing. While I was hoping for Chiori to follow in Navia's footsteps and help bring their element out of its isolated corner, she turned out to be much more of a traditional Chiyo character. But it turns out that this isn't as big a downside as I'd expected. She's such a joy to watch whenever she shows up in the story that I had no choice but to get her, and overall I'm glad to have listened to my heart. Even in just a few days of having her, I found many new teams which are powerful and unique, and I'll doubtless find more in the future. If you're not completely smitten by her, I'd say at least hold off until she gets a rerun, and save your primos for the upcoming banners. But if you're only holding back due to the mixed reviews, I think you'd be glad to have her. I definitely am. Until next time!